is right across Sydney. And
it is a template. The coverage is almost ritualistic now.
Heavily armed policemen.
You only need 20 seconds of dramatic footage, and then you put that on a loop.
We seem to have thrown out the social responsibility of journalism just for get the 24-hour news cycle going.
And in fact, they help to create a climate of fear and hysteria.
The next time a story like this occurs, journalists might want to start their reports with what is not happening. Like, this was not a terrorist conspiracy. It was not the work of ISIL or Al-Qaeda. It was one man who happened to be Muslim with a gun. And it was not, despite the rhetoric reverberating across the airwaves, Australia's 9/11.
People have already written in Australia that the Sydney siege was Australia's September 11. And that's, I mean, it's utterly ridiculous. It's also offensive. It's offensive to the almost 3,000 people who died in September 11 and the hundreds of thousands of Muslims who died after September 11 in response. The Sydney siege was a lone gunman with a grudge and a shotgun. But if one lone gunman holding 17 hostages in a cafe is our September 11, well, I think that speaks volumes about our capacity to be frightened.
When things like this happen, there's a quick rush to judge it as an Islamic terrorist act. It's always the angle that's first presumed. If someone goes up and shoots up a cinema in the United States and kills people, no one calls it Christian terrorism if the person is Christian. But for some reason, unfortunately, the narrative has been that the religion comes into play if the person is from an Islamic background, when sometimes the actions of that person have nothing to do with Islam.
While the US media was reporting on the siege in Sydney, there was a far greater mass shooting incident happening within the US where a gunman had killed 5 people and was on the loose. But all national media in the United States was focused on Sydney, even though proportionally the crime was smaller and the distance was far greater. This is an abdication of the media's role to report responsibly and chasing stories around the world which may have any tangential or small connection to terrorism, regardless of how remote that connection is.
And you notice how they described him as a self-proclaimed cleric, right? Now, what does a self-proclaimed cleric is? What does that mean? He's a fake. He's not a cleric. He's a fake. He just goes around with this headgear and a robe, and you know, and of course he has a black beard. So he's a terrorist. And we confronted this same sort of trope several weeks ago in Canada, where apparently the country changed instantly, again because of one man with one gun.
The parallels between the siege in Sydney and the shootings in Ottawa 6 weeks ago are by no means exact. The Canadian gunman infiltrated Parliament before being killed. But both perpetrators were societal misfits. Both were in trouble with the law, the Australian over sexual allegations, the Canadian over drugs, and they shared a religion. The other parallel between Sydney and Ottawa was the coverage of the stories. In the early, confusing stages, both sets of journalists were rather excitable, their reporting often inaccurate.
In the course of this story, media reported that the Sydney airspace had been closed. They reported that raids were carrying out across the city.
For example, we were told that there were more than one shooter.
1 or 2 or 3 shooters at large.
We were told that he was part of conspiracy.
I don't know what to tell you, this coming the day after all the talk of terrorism.
They reported that the Harbour Bridge had been closed. One of the front page headlines was a death cult in the Sydney CBD. If one man is a death cult.
We were told that the Canadian Security Intelligence Service was rounding up 90 other extremists.
There's still, ticking time bombs.
Hell-bent on sowing mayhem and destruction in Canada.
This is just coming in.
And that the Canadian shooter was on a watch list.
It's very upsetting down here right now.
All these stories are wrong, of course.
There's a journalistic maxim as time-worn as it is cynical. Never let the facts get in the way of a good story. It needs updating for the post-9/11 era. Never let the established narrative template go unused if you want a good story. It's the idea that everything changed on 9/11, so anything that subsequently seems 9/11 related, even in the slightest way, will be reported along the same lines using similar terminology.
When I saw that headline that suggested that we have all changed forever because of this event, I thought that was very interesting because there have been many mass shooting events in Australian history in the past. Similarly in Ottawa as well.
Put a bullet through the heart of the Canadian state.
There were certain Canadian media outlets which suggested this has been a transformative moment as though everything had changed. But you do not see this after other crimes or other incidents of violence. The fact that terrorist attacks seem to have a different psychological effect, partly in the way they're reported, whereas in reality they're mostly, unremarkable acts of criminals, and the way the media reports it actually imbues them with greater significance than they hold. And in fact, it helps to terrorize the population in a far greater way than they would without that type of reporting.
The terror in the city formula really is about making money. And the best way to make money is to control people through something, and in this case it's fear.
They're going in as we speak.
And so the fear gets ramped up and the ratings go higher.
When people feel their domestic mainstream media do not speak for them, whether it's Egyptians in Tahrir Square or Black Americans in Ferguson, Missouri, they tend to turn to social media. And that's what happened in Australia with the I'll Ride With You campaign. As the news from the cafe was breaking, a Muslim woman was seen on a bus, removing her headscarf. She feared a backlash. Another woman saw that, and what began as an act of solidarity, an offer to ride with the Muslim woman, grew into a hashtag that quickly went global. Judging from the comments and offers made, the message was, even if it troubled few, and some in the mainstream media have their reasons to divide us, that will not happen.
Social media is increasingly playing a huge role in the reporting of a lot of these stories. The I'll Ride With You campaign, that had a huge dramatic effect on especially the Muslim community. Unfortunately, all of us are us. It's not us versus them, we're all us. So I think people are doing something to change what's being reported out there. It's put it up on Twitter and then it's just gone as a global phenomenon. And then we've had so many reports of people being given lifts home and amazing things that have happened. Social media, I think, is coming to the fore and bringing out the real feelings of the society. Really, I think, touching people on a personal level rather than the mainstream media does.
On the download this week, our viewers on the coverage of the hostage-taking in Sydney and the challenges of covering breaking news.
The role of responsible media during a terrorist attack, whether in Sydney, Boston, Ottawa or anywhere else, is to report accurately and fairly, not exaggerating what we know and what we don't know. During the recent Sydney siege, too many in the Australian and global press ignored this rule. Our role as journalists is to be far more critical, to analyse if terrorism is because of our own actions and a response to it.
Examples like the Daily Telegraph's article, which read as the headline, "Death Cult CBD Attack the Instant We Changed Forever," instantly insinuates as fact that there was religious motivation behind what happened. I don't think personally that Australia has changed forever, but I think this goes to show that the media in general and as a whole has a long way to go.